Today's lesson 14. Let's play a game. We're going to read a list of freedoms or activities. If the activity is something you're allowed to do in your country, stand up. If it's something you are not allowed to do, sit down. Just stand up if it's something that is legal and permissible for you to do in your country, not necessarily if you do it or not. As we read this list, think about what all these activities share in common. They all pertain to freedoms. But what kind of freedoms? Stand up if you're allowed to talk about God. Stand up if you're allowed to read the Bible. Stand up if you're allowed to go to church. Stand up if you're allowed to worship God with music. Stand up if you're allowed to pray. If you are standing up the entire time, you should be very grateful. Being able to do all these things means that you live in a country where you have freedom of religion. This means you are able to worship God however you see fit. Not all people share this freedom. There are some places in the world where you cannot worship God freely, and if you do, you could be fined or even placed in jail. On your activity break, you can talk about or do some research about places where religious freedom is not available and what is life like in those places for Christians. The separatists. Back in the 16th and 17th century, many people who lived in England did not have freedom of religion. They had to worship God the way that the Church of England told them to worship. There were people called separatists who did not agree with the teaching of the Church of England, and they wanted to form their own churches. However, they were not allowed. So, in 1608, a group of separatists left England in search of a home where they could worship God freely. They traveled to Holland, where they were able to worship God the way they felt was right. However, life in Holland wasn't easy. The English separatists had left everything behind in order to worship God. But now they feared that they would lose their English culture if they remained in Holland. Their fear had them to seek other places to settle and establish their way of life. Journey to America. After much thought, the separatists decided that they would make the long trip across the ocean and settle in the America. However, they did not have much money, and a trip to the New World was quite expensive. So they made a deal with several investors who agreed to pay for the trip and provide all of the supplies. In exchange, the colonists would send the investors resources, such as timber and fur. The colonists agreed to do this for several years until the debt was repaid. Does this remind you of a term from our last lesson? Can you recall what it is? In a sense, they had become indentured servants. After a great deal of struggle to secure passage, 41 separatists boarded the Mayflower, along with other English colonists. On September 6, 1620, a total of 102 passengers embarked on a journey to America. While less than half of the passengers were separatists on a voyage seeking a place where they could worship freely while continuing their English way of life without outside interference, everyone on the ship eventually became known as pilgrims. The Mayflower Compact. It is important to know that the Mayflower was supposed to land near what we know as New York City. If you'll recall, most of the east coast of North America was known as Virginia, and the Pilgrims had planned to settle farther north, while still living in Virginia and under the rule of England. However, bad weather had blown the ship off course, and they had ended up making landfall much farther north. In fact, they were so far north that they were no longer in Virginia. This meant there was no government, and no government meant no laws. The Pilgrims knew this could be a problem. So while they were still on board the ship, they wrote and signed what is known as the Mayflower Compact. on November 11th, 1620. This document acted as a set of laws and guaranteed that the separatists and the other British colonists would be able to live peaceably with each other. Arriving in America, while they made landfall in November in Provincetown, it wasn't until December that they found a suitable place to settle in Plymouth. The area they decided upon would make a good home. It had a water source and was located on a hill. Maybe it was easy to defend, but it also happened to contain an abandoned village. What the Pilgrims did not know was that a short time before they had arrived, disease had spread through the land, killing many of the indigenous Americans who lived there. The abandoned village had belonged to the Wapatego tribe. Again, I'm not sure that's pronounced properly. After a long journey, they docked their ship in Plymouth Harbor and continued to live aboard the vessel while they established their colony. Unfortunately, they were not prepared for the cold, harsh winter. With little food and improper shelter, things did not look good for the colonists. Due to the cold, wet living conditions and lack of food, many of the Pilgrims became ill. By the end of their first year, only 52 of the 102 colonists that were on the Mayflower were still alive. A peaceful arrangement. While illness, cold, and hard work had caused struggle for the Pilgrims, they had a peaceful relationship with local indigenous Americans. The partnership helped them build a stronger colony in March of 1621. The Pilgrims signed an agreement with the Wapatog people. In it, both sides agreed to protect and help each other and to handle disagreements peaceably. The Pilgrims and the indigenous people were so committed to keeping the peace between themselves that the treaty even made a plan for punishment. If one of the settlers broke the treaty, he or she would be sent to the indigenous tribe for punishment. Likewise, if an indigenous American broke the treaty, he or she would be sent to the Pilgrims for justice. What exactly this justice included, we don't know for sure, but this system allowed for accountability between the two groups. Many historians believe that this agreement between the two groups was more about each of them looking out for themselves rather than about showing kindness towards each other. Having been devastated by disease, the Wapatos valued the protection of the British from rival tribes, and the colonists relied on the indigenous Americans to help them plant and harvest their food. However, regardless of why it was established, this peaceable relationship soon proved to be something worth celebrating. That concludes Lesson 14.